The fighting on Israel's northern and southern fronts has suddenly escalated to a dangerous new intensity, with Hezbollah firing over 300 rockets in a single day into Galilee and Iranian-backed groups in Syria and Yemen launching coordinated drone swarms that have pierced parts of the Iron Dome coverage. If this multi-front pressure continues unchecked, Israel risks exhausting its reservist manpower within weeks, seeing its economy contract by double digits, and facing a domestic political crisis that could fracture the wartime unity government. Yet beneath these visible clashes on the ground and in the skies lies a far larger great power contest over Middle Eastern energy routes, proxy influence, and the future balance of conventional and asymmetric warfare that is quietly testing every assumption about Israel's long-term survival. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. It all traces back to the 28th of February, 2026, when American and Israeli jets carried out the epic anger strikes that killed Iran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and several senior Revolutionary Guard commanders. Tehran's response was immediate and calculated. It activated its full axis of resistance. Hezbollah in Lebanon moved from border skirmishes to all-out rocket barrages. The Houthis resumed attacks on shipping and Israeli targets, and Syrian militias opened a third front from the Golan Heights. Within 72 hours, Israel found itself fighting on 4 separate axes simultaneously for the first time since the War of Independence. The IDF, already stretched thin after more than a year of operations in Gaza, suddenly had to pivot entire divisions northward while keeping enough forces in the south to prevent a Hamas resurgence. What the outside world sees on television is the spectacular footage of interceptors lighting up the night sky and columns of smoke rising from Lebanese villages. What is not shown is the quiet erosion happening inside Israel's own system. The first and perhaps most immediate fatal weakness is manpower exhaustion across multiple theaters. Israel's active duty force is small, around 170,000, and it relies on nearly 500,000 reservists for any sustained conflict. After 17 months of continuous call UPS since October 2023, many units are already on their 3rd or 4th tour. Reservists who own businesses are watching their companies collapse. Parents of young children are missing critical milestones. And the psychological toll is showing in rising mental health reports among both soldiers and their families. The military is now quietly extending service terms and lowering medical exemption standards, moves that buy time but plant seeds of long-term resentment. The second weakness is the silent depletion of the air defense inventory itself. The Iron Dome, David's sling, and arrow systems have performed remarkably, but every successful intercept costs between $50,000 and several $1 million depending on the missile type. Hezbollah alone is estimated to possess over 150,000 rockets and drones, and it is firing them in salvos deliberately designed to overwhelm the interceptors. Intelligence assessments shared with the cabinet show that at current expenditure rates, critical stockpiles of Tamir interceptors could drop below operational safety margins within 3 to 4 weeks if the pace does not slow. Replenishment from the United States is happening, but the American defense industrial base is itself strained by simultaneous support for Ukraine and preparations in the Indo-Pacific. Israel is therefore rationing intercepts, allowing some smaller rockets to land in open areas, a policy that saves munitions but damages public confidence every time a house or school is hit. The third weakness lies in the economic hemorrhage that is accelerating faster than most analysts predicted. War spending is already running at over $10 billion a month. The shekel has lost nearly 15% of its value since the Iranian strikes began. Tourism, which normally contributes 5% of GDP, has evaporated. High-tech startups that drive Israel's innovation edge are struggling to retain foreign talent and investment as employees are repeatedly called up. The energy shock from the partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz has added another layer, although Israel is less dependent on Gulf oil than Japan. The global price spike has driven up electricity and fuel costs, forcing factories to cut shifts and families to face higher bills. The combination of mobilization costs, lost productivity, and imported inflation is creating a feedback loop that private economists warn could push the country into technical recession by the third quarter of 2026. The fourth and perhaps most insidious weakness is the growing diplomatic and domestic isolation. Internationally, the narrative has shifted. Even traditional allies in Europe are expressing quiet fatigue with the scale of civilian casualties reported from Lebanon and Gaza. The United States, while still providing military aid, is distracted by its own domestic political battles and the need to keep the Gulf open. China and Russia are actively courting the global south with narratives that frame Israel as the aggressor in a wider anti-imperialist struggle. Inside Israel itself, the wartime unity that existed in the early months is fracturing. Protest movements that paused after the Iranian strikes have resumed, this time mixing calls for hostage deals with accusations that the government is pursuing an unwinnable multi-front war. Polls show that support for continuing operations in Lebanon has dropped below 50% for the first time since the fighting intensified, creating a dangerous gap between the military's assessment of what is required and the public's willingness to endure. These four weaknesses are not separate problems. They reinforce one another in a vicious cycle. Manpower shortages force commanders to rely more heavily on air power and missile defense, which accelerates inventory depletion and drives up costs. Economic pain fuels domestic discontent, which in turn pressures politicians to seek quick diplomatic exits that the military believes would only invite future attacks. And the growing international criticism makes resupply and political cover harder to obtain, deepening the isolation. It is this interlocking nature that makes the current situation qualitatively different from any previous round of fighting. If we pull the lens back slightly, the contrast with Iran's strategy becomes clear. Tehran is not trying to win a conventional war. It is deliberately bleeding Israel on multiple low-intensity fronts, forcing Jerusalem to choose between exhausting itself or accepting a new reality of permanent mobilization. Hezbollah's leader has publicly stated that his forces will continue until Israel withdraws from all disputed border areas and stops operations in Gaza. The Houthis have made similar vows regarding Red Sea shipping. This is classic attrition warfare designed to exploit the very asymmetries that Israel's technological superiority was supposed to overcome. Yet, even as the pressure mounts, there are signs that Israel is attempting to break the cycle. Special forces raids deep into Lebanon have disrupted several rocket launch sites, and cyber operations have reportedly degraded Iranian command and control nodes. The question is whether these tactical successes can outpace the strategic erosion happening at home. The coming weeks will be decisive. If Israel can force a pause on at least one front, it may buy the breathing room needed to replenish stocks and stabilize the economy. If not, the four weaknesses could compound into a genuine systemic crisis. Yet even as the pressure mounts, there are signs that Israel is attempting to break the cycle. Special forces raids deep into Lebanon have disrupted several rocket launch sites, and cyber operations have reportedly degraded Iranian command and control nodes. The question is whether these tactical successes can outpace the strategic erosion happening at home. The coming weeks will be decisive. If Israel can force a pause on at least one front, it may buy the breathing room needed to replenish stocks and stabilize the economy. If not, the four weaknesses could compound into a genuine systemic crisis. The situation carries an eerie echo of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Israel was caught off guard by a coordinated surprise attack from Egypt and Syria. Back then, the country faced simultaneous fronts, rapid depletion of ammunition, and a sudden economic shock as oil prices quadrupled. The difference is that in 1973, the United States airlifted massive supplies within days, and the conflict ended in a matter of weeks. Today, the resupply pipeline is slower. The fronts are more numerous, and the adversary is not two conventional armies, but a network of proxies designed precisely to avoid presenting a single target that can be decisively destroyed. Hezbollah has learned the lessons of 2006 and 2023. It no longer masses forces in ways that invite airstrikes, but instead disperses launchers across civilian areas and underground tunnels, turning every intercept into a moral and political cost, as well as a financial one. This brings us to the larger great power contest quietly unfolding behind the smoke. Iran is not acting alone. Moscow and Beijing have both increased diplomatic and material support for Tehran's axis, not out of ideological loyalty, but because a weakened Israel serves their broader interests. Russia benefits from diverted American attention away from Ukraine. China gains leverage in the global south by positioning itself as the voice of restraint, while quietly purchasing discounted Iranian oil that now flows through alternative routes. The United States finds itself in the uncomfortable position of needing to reassure Israel without further stretching its own military logistics already committed to Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Every additional shipment of interceptors to Tel Aviv means fewer available for potential contingencies elsewhere. This is the true blind spot. Israel's survival has become entangled in a global zero, some game where its security is no longer the sole priority of its main patron. If the conflict drags into the summer of 2026, several future scenarios begin to crystallize. In the most optimistic case for Jerusalem, targeted operations combined with American diplomatic pressure force Hezbollah to accept a ceasefire along the Litani River, allowing Israel to declare a limited victory and begin demobilization. Reserves return to the economy, the shekel stabilizes, and international criticism fades as focus shifts elsewhere. Yet even in this best case, the underlying vulnerabilities remain. The next round of fighting could come sooner and with even more sophisticated weapons. In the middle scenario, a prolonged war of attrition leads to a negotiated pause brokered by Egypt and Qatar, but at the cost of territorial concessions in the north and a permanent increase in defense spending that crowds out investment in education and technology. The most pessimistic path sees the multi-front pressure continue until domestic political collapse forces early elections and a new government that accepts a unilateral withdrawal, handing the proxies a narrative victory that encourages further escalation in the years ahead. What makes these scenarios more than academic exercises is the human and societal cost already visible. Reservists who have missed 2 consecutive harvest seasons in the Galilee are quietly selling farmland. High-tech firms are relocating key research teams to Cyprus and Greece to escape repeated call UPS. Young Israelis are postponing marriages and children because the future feels too uncertain. The very demographic advantage Israel has long relied upon is beginning to erode as emigration talks rise in private conversations. This is not defeatism. It is the quiet realization that no amount of Iron Dome batteries can protect a society if its people lose faith in the sustainability of the struggle. There is also a deeper philosophical question that few leaders dare voice publicly. For decades, Israel has bet its existence on technological superiority and the willingness of its citizens to endure hardship. The current test is whether that formula still holds when the enemy refuses to fight on your terms and instead turns every civilian area into a battlefield while the world watches through smartphone cameras. Superiority in drones and cyber tools matters less when the adversary's strategy is simply to outlast you. History is littered with examples of technologically advanced powers that eventually bled out against determined irregular forces, from the French in Algeria to the Americans in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Israel has always insisted it is different because its survival is existential. The question now is whether that existential drive can survive repeated multi-year mobilizations that hollow out the very society it seeks to protect. Pulling the lens back even further reveals how this conflict is reshaping the global order in ways that will matter long after the rockets stop flying. The United States is learning the limits of its power projection when multiple theaters ignite simultaneously. Europe is discovering that energy security and Middle East stability are no longer distant concern. China and Russia are testing whether they can indirectly bleed their strategic rival without crossing direct red lines. And the global south is watching closely to see whether a small nation backed by the West can indefinitely withstand an axis supported by the East. In this sense, the fighting along Israel's borders has become a laboratory for 21st century warfare, a contest between precision technology and mass persistence, between alliance loyalty and domestic endurance, between short-term military necessity and long-term societal resilience. The coming months will not merely decide the outcome of this particular round. They will reveal whether a nation built on the promise of never again can adapt its model of security to an era when its adversaries have mastered the art of bleeding without bleeding themselves. Israel stands at a crossroads where every tactical victory on the front line must be weighed against the strategic cost at home. The four fatal weaknesses exposed in this conflict are not new. They have always existed beneath the surface. What is new is that the multi-front pressure has finally forced them into the open where they can no longer be ignored. Friends, we have walked through the immediate battlefield realities, the four interlocking weaknesses, the historical echoes, the great power calculations, the possible futures, and the deeper questions this moment raises for Israel and the world. What remains is for all of us to watch how Jerusalem chooses to respond. History rarely grants second chances at the same crossroads, yet this moment feels precisely like one. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Israel can transform these exposed weaknesses into a catalyst for deeper strategic reform, or will the weight of prolonged attrition prove too heavy? How do you see the great power contest behind the scenes shaping the outcome? Which of the four fatal weaknesses concerns you most for Israel's long-term future? Share your perspective below and let us continue this conversation together. Thank you for staying with me through this extended analysis. I will see you in the next video where we turn to the next chapter of this turbulent era.